I want to talk about what I think is one of the most quietly destructive lies in this entire hobby. And I think it's the way we talk about the Forever GM. As though this is just a charming personality type, as though this is simply the generous one, the passionate one, the one who just happens to love running games more than everyone else. When in reality, that framing kind of works like a sedative, because it flatters the person carrying the burden just enough to stop them from naming the burden at all. So that's the first thing I want to say clearly without dressing it up, because I think a lot of people need to hear this in plain language. A shocking number of Forever GMs are not Forever GMs because they freely and joyfully chose a permanent creative service role for the rest of their gaming life. They became Forever GMs because if they did not step up, their game wouldn't happen. Their campaign wouldn't happen, the hobby wouldn't happen, for that group at least, and somewhere along the way, that necessity got romanticized into identity. Like, you're a Forever GM. Great. Man, but I think that's such an important distinction, because once necessity gets mistaken for personality, exploitation becomes very hard to detect. If everybody around you starts describing your over-functioning as some sort of a gift, your strength, your role, your thing, then what happens is that the imbalance stops looking like imbalance and it starts to look like destiny. Like, it's your destiny, man. It starts to sound noble that you're the Forever GM. It starts to sound like, well, you know, you're just the creative one. You're just the natural GM, man. You're the one who's good at this stuff. And the whole time underneath that flattering language, what is really happening is much uglier and much simpler as well. One person is taking responsibility for making sure the machine turns on, and everyone else is slowly getting used to the hum of that machine as though it were ambient noise. And that is where I think the resentment starts for a lot of Forever GMs, although many of them don't allow themselves to call it resentment because it sounds petty, because it sounds ungrateful, because it sounds like betrayal against their hobby, the hobby they so genuinely love. So instead they call it tiredness, they call it lack of inspiration, they call it needing a break, they call it being busy lately. But often what is actually sitting underneath all of that is the dawning realization that the arrangement was never as mutual as they wanted to believe. Because being the person who always preps, always organizes, always reads the rules, always recruits, always reminds people of the schedule, always sets the tone, always pushes through dead moments, always compensates when energy drops, and always cares just a little bit more than everybody else, is not merely a creative position. It is an asymmetrical labor position. And once you see it that way, the whole sentimental myth of the Forever GM starts to crumble. Because now it's not, this is the person who loves the hobby the most. Now it becomes, this is the person the hobby has learned to lean on the hardest. And it's not the same thing, not even close. And this is where I think psychology becomes incredibly useful. Where competence becomes permission. That's where I want to go next. Because Forever GMs often know something is wrong long before they have words for it, long before they have language for it. And once you do get the language or the words for it, the pattern becomes almost painfully obvious, because what looks on the surface like passion and competence can, at a group level, create the exact conditions that make everybody else weaker participants. That is the paradox. Your strength does not simply inspire effort. Very often it replaces the need for effort. And human beings adapt to that unbelievably fast. If one person in a group, not only in TTRPGs by the way, this can be at work, in teams, in anything. If one person in a group consistently absorbs the uncertainty, the planning, the initiative, the emotional regulation, and the friction that would otherwise force collective participation, the group does not usually become more active in response. Actually, they become more passive. Not because people are monsters, by the way, not because they're all selfish or malicious or secretly trying to exploit you, like some kind of a cartoon villain. No, not at all. But because that is what groups do when labor is already being performed. Most people settle into it. They normalize it. They stop bracing for a responsibility that never actually lands on them. And that is the ugly brilliance of competence in a group setting. Once you demonstrate that you can and you will cover the gap stops being perceived as urgent. Think about how many times this happens at the table. There's a lull, a decision point, a moment where nobody quite knows what to do. Conversation loses pressure, the energy leaks out, the party dithers, someone shrugs, someone says, I don't know, what do you guys think? And then nobody really thinks anything. They don't think anything with enough force to move the scene. And we can't help it but then in that tiny vacuum, you as a GM, you step in. Because you do what a good GM does. You clarify, you summarize, you start to sharpen the options, you throw in an NPC reaction. And I get it, sometimes that's needed, of course. You add momentum, you save the moment. But because you saved it, the table learns the wrong lesson. Because they didn't learn we had to rise to the occasion there. They didn't learn we had to take ownership. They didn't learn we had to decide under uncertainty. No, the lesson the table learns is much more corrosive. They learn that the system will catch them. That is the lesson. The system will catch us. And if people believe that the system will catch them all the time, they don't have to develop initiative at the same speed. They don't have to tolerate uncertainty at the same speed. They don't have to generate momentum. Why would they? Because the table and the story and the campaign survives without it. The story survives without it. The night survives without it. The game keeps moving because you moved it as a GM. So when forever GMs say that they feel like they are doing everything, I don't hear the melodrama in that. I hear someone describing a perfectly rational group dynamic that has been allowed to settle into an unhealthy equilibrium, where one person's competence has effectively become permission for everyone else's underdevelopment. And man, that's devastating, because competence is supposed to feel rewarding, right? It's supposed to make things better. But here, competence becomes a trap. The better you are, the less visible the missing effort of others becomes. Because your skill covers for it so efficiently that the table can still call the night a success. I mean, I don't want to thump myself on the chest on this. I sound a little bit cocky here. But in any case, it means the system can remain dysfunctional for a very long time without ever appearing broken. Now, here's where I want to be very careful, because I don't want this to become one of those shallow rants where every player gets turned into some lazy parasite caricature. It's not true, and it's not useful, and it misses the deeper social reality entirely. So I want to talk about passive players and active extraction. A lot of passive players are not passive because they're malicious. They are passive because they've been socialized into passivity by the structure of the table, by prior experiences, by insecurity, by fear of doing the wrong thing, by not wanting to hog the spotlight, by not really understanding what level of authorship is expected of them, or by simply falling into habits that were never interrupted. And this but really matters, because there is a point where this compassion that you feel, that empathy for that passivity, becomes cover for a one-sided arrangement, Because whatever the causes are, there are absolutely tables where the relationship has become extractive. The GM brings the world, the energy, the movement, the interpretation, the recovery, the pressure, the contingency planning, the character voices, the stakes, the connective tissue, the rulings, the emotional temperature control, the narrative salvage operation every time things go slack. And the players, they bring reception, enjoyment, reaction, they bring the vibes, and they bring appreciation after the fact. And appreciation is nice. It's not nothing. But appreciation is not reciprocity. And that is where I want to draw a line in the sand here, because it's the line people are so often afraid to draw. A player saying, "That session was amazing, man," is not the same thing as helping carry what made it amazing. A player having fun is not the same thing as being part of the engine that produces the fun. A player being entertained, amused, emotionally moved, or even deeply invested in their own character is not automatically the same thing as contributing to the table as a shared creative organism. And I think forever GMs feel this difference on a cellular level. They may not always articulate it cleanly, but they do feel it. They feel the difference between a table that is alive and a table that is merely consuming well-produced content. They feel the difference between co-creation and audiencehood. They feel the difference between collaboration and extraction. Because extraction is exactly what it starts to resemble when the hobby becomes dependent on one person's willingness to always bring more than everyone else. And that word extraction makes people uncomfortable because it sounds too harsh for something as friendly and as voluntary as a game night, as a TTRPG night. But voluntary settings can still produce exploitative patterns. Informal spaces can still normalize asymmetry. A table can be full of nice people and still run an arrangement that quietly drains one person more than the others. Those things are not contradictory. In fact, that is one of the reasons that it becomes so hard to name. Because if people were cruel, then it would be easy. If they were dismissive or entitled or openly rude to you or selfish in very obvious ways, then the GM could point to the behavior and say, "Hey, that right there, that's the problem." But often it's way softer and nicer than that, because people are grateful and they do show up and they laugh and they say they love the campaign. They may even tell you you're an incredible GM, and all of that can be true, while the structure itself remains badly imbalanced. Which is why forever GMs often feel so strange when the burnout starts. Because they are surrounded by signs that everyone is enjoying themselves. And yet, inside, they are becoming more and more aware that enjoyment is not the same thing as shared responsibility. And that is a brutal thing to realize about a hobby that you love. Because it means the applause can be genuine and still not be enough. I also think one of the reasons forever GMs feel so invisible in these discussions is that most people only count the labor they can see. They count the notes, they count the maps, the stat blocks, the world building you've done, the monster prep, the session outlines, the handouts, the initiative tracking, the rule lookups, the battle maps, the music playlists, the miniatures, the documents, the scheduling, all of that. And yes, all of that certainly is labor. But I would argue that for many forever GMs out there, and if you've experienced this, please put it in the comments. The labor that burns the deepest is not the visible labor at all. It is the invisible labor. It's the hidden labor, the emotional labor, the cognitive labor. The social balancing act of being the person who's not only running the fiction, but constantly monitoring the human atmosphere around the fiction so that the whole night doesn't fall apart. You recognize this. Because as a GM, you are reading people all the time. You're noticing who is drifting. You notice who is quiet in a bad way and who is quiet in a thinking way. You notice who is dominating too much. You notice who has spoken No, who hasn't spoken in 20 minutes? You're noticing when someone is confused but doesn't want to admit it. You notice when the energy dips after a scene that should have landed harder. You notice when two players want fundamentally different things from the session. You notice when someone needs a little push and when someone needs a little space. You notice when the table needs humor and when it needs gravity. You notice when a rule needs clarification and when it would kill the mood. You notice whether the room feels tense or bored or overwhelmed or disconnected or stuck. You feel all those things. And while all of that is happening, you are still supposed to perform competence. You are still supposed to look smooth. You're still supposed to look like the person who knows where this is going. Even when half of your actual work in that moment is not storytelling at all, but emotional regulation and group management. It's not the first time that I've seen a meme of the GM after a 4-hour session arriving home completely drained. That's what it feels like, man. It's exhausting. And it's exhausting in a very particular way because invisible labor never gets counted at the same weight as visible labor. People see the dungeon, but they don't see the emotional triage. They notice the cool NPC voice. They don't notice the split-second choice to use that voice because the room needed energy. They see the mystery reveal, but they don't see the 10 little calibrations you made beforehand to stop the group from losing interest before they got there. So when forever GMs say that they're tired, it's not always because prep takes time. That's the fun part, honestly. Sometimes it's because they're functioning as a host, a director, mediator, entertainer, teacher, referee, dramaturge, scheduler, maybe your therapist, improviser, and a social shock absorber all at once. And most of those roles are so normalized that nobody even thinks to call them labor anymore. And once it becomes invisible, it becomes expected. And then we fall in the same trap again. Not just doing the work so reliably, so gracefully, so habitually that the group stops perceiving it as work in the first place. Which means when you begin to crack under it, people can be genuinely surprised. Because from their perspective, the magic was just happening. They never see the machinery, because you are the machinery. But then the bill arrives. This is the part I really want forever GMs to hear, because I think a lot of you still carry private shame about it, and that shame makes you misdiagnose what's happening. Burnout is not proof that you love the hobby incorrectly. Burnout is not proof that you're not resilient enough. Burnout is not proof that you've become cynical or lazy or bitter or somehow spiritually worse than you were when you started. Burnout in this context is accounting. That's all it is. It is the bill arriving for an arrangement that was running on unpaid labor for far too long. And I want to sit with that for a second because I think it's so important. It's incredibly important. When something in your life is sustained by enthusiasm, people often mistake that enthusiasm for a resource that replenishes itself automatically. They treat passion as though it were solar power, endless and clean and always there. But passion is not an infinite source. Passion can be converted into obligation, and passion can be overdrawn. Passion can be mined so continuously that the person providing it begins to feel alienated from the very thing they once loved. And this is exactly why so many forever GMs say some version of the same sentence. I still love the hobby. I still love it to death. I just don't know if I can keep doing this. And I think it says everything because it reveals that the love for the game is still there, but the role somehow has become corrosive. The issue is not lack of care, it is surplus responsibility. The issue is not that the game stopped mattering, it is that the game has become too dependent on one person's ability to keep mattering enough for everybody. There's something especially cruel about the way this lands, because the better your intentions were, the longer it can take you to admit what is happening. If you care deeply about your friends, if you love giving them memorable experiences, if you take pride in your craft, if you genuinely enjoy creating, then you can absorb a shocking amount of imbalance before your own body and mind finally starts to say, no man, this is no longer mutual enough to sustain. That is when prep begins to feel heavier than it used to. It's when a cancellation feels less disappointing and maybe even secretly relieving. That's when the idea of running next week produces stress or tension instead of real excitement. It's when you begin to fantasize, not about quitting the hobby or anything, but about someone or anyone taking the wheel for once, so you can just exist inside of their world instead of holding it together from the outside. I think that fantasy contains a truth forever GMs are sometimes reluctant to face. A lot of them don't actually want to stop gaming. Not at all. They want to stop being structurally necessary. They want to know what the hobby feels like when their presence is not the thing preventing total collapse. They want to discover whether the people around them can generate momentum too, and they can carry the tone too, initiate to, create to, and that they can risk awkwardness too. They want proof that their table is a table and not a one-person power grid with chairs around it. And I'm telling you that desire is not petty. It's not selfish. It's the most reasonable desire in the world. So stop saving the table. And I think this is where the harshest truth lives, and that's what I want to talk about next. So this is where the harshest truth lives, like I said. And it is also where I think the deepest empathy has to live, because what I'm about to say is very difficult, precisely because it attacks the instinct that makes you a good GM in the first place. The instinct to save the moment, the instinct to smooth the dead air, the instinct to rescue pacing, the instinct to clarify confusion before it becomes discomfort, the instinct to introduce momentum before inertia hardens, the instinct to make sure everyone is still having a good time, the instinct to care enough to prevent failure. Man, that instinct is admirable. Absolutely. It is also very often that exact instinct that keeps the larger problem hidden. Because if you're always there to save the table from itself, then the table never has to confront what it actually is without your intervention. And that is, during play, why silence matters so much more than people think. Silence is diagnostic. Silence reveals the true structure of the group. Silence shows you whether your players are tentative because they need confidence, passive because they have been trained into passivity, avoidant because they're afraid of ownership, or simply comfortable waiting because the system has always rewarded waiting. But if you cannot stand that silence, if you flood it immediately with better options, stronger prompts, sharper summaries, cleaner hooks, or a convenient, sudden NPC, then the truth never surfaces. The system remains protected from self-knowledge. The table continues to believe that it is collaborating because the points at which collaborations would actually need to prove itself are constantly being padded over by your competence. And I understand why forever GMs do this. I really do. It's not only forever GMs, many GMs. But I understand why you do this. I really do. Because awkwardness feels like failure when you're behind the screen. Dead air feels like it's your fault. Confusion feels like you didn't present things clearly enough. Indecision feels like weak facilitation. Loss of momentum feels like something you should have anticipated. So you fix it. Of course you fix it. That's what you have trained yourself to do throughout the years that you've been doing this. But the longer you keep fixing every symptom, the longer you protect the underlying condition. And at some point, if things are ever going to change, you may have to do something that feels almost unbearable to a highly competent GM. You may have to stop rescuing the table long enough for the table to reveal whether it can stand on its own. You may have to let this silence breathe. You may have to let the players feel the weight of a moment with no immediate safety rail. You may have to let uncertainty remain unresolved for a little longer than is comfortable. You may have to ask a question and not answer it for them. You may have to allow the energy to drop low enough that someone else finally feels the need to lift it. Because that is the thing nobody wants to say out loud. Some groups never develop initiative because the GM's competence has made initiative optional. Optional. That's the word. And optional behaviors don't get cultivated reliably in groups. Necessary behaviors do. So if player agency and player authorship and player ownership and shared creative momentum are truly what you want, then there has to be some real transfer of necessity. Not just in theory, in practice, in the room, in the actual social physics of the table. Otherwise, everybody can keep talking about collaboration while one person continues to do the emotional and structural heavy lifting that collaboration was supposed to distribute. And yeah, that means change may feel ugly at first. It may mean sessions become a little rough. It may mean your players look uncertain. It may mean some of them realize how much they were relying on your overfunctioning. It may mean the group has to face truths about itself that were previously softened by your labor. But those truths were always there. You would not be creating them. You would only be stopping yourself from hiding them. And I think that is where this whole conversation lands for me, because forever GMs deserve better than being endlessly praised for how much they can endure. They deserve better than being treated like noble beasts of burden for everyone else's entertainment. They deserve better than being told that the answer to every structural problem is just to prep smarter, just communicate better, care more efficiently, or somehow turn themselves into even more advanced service providers for a table that has forgotten how much it asks of them. Sometimes the most loving thing a forever GM can do for a table is not to give more. It is to withdraw just enough support that the truth becomes visible. Let the silence stand. Let a sort of vacuum appear. Let the group feel, maybe for the first time, that the game is not self-propelled, that the energy is not automatic, that the magic is not ambient, and that somebody has been paying for all of this with real effort for a very long time. Because once that truth is visible, one of two things happens. Either the table begins finally to grow up, or the illusion collapses. And as painful as that second possibility is, even that can be clarifying, because at least then you are no longer confusing your ability to sustain an experience with proof that the experience was ever equally shared. That's the harsh truth. And I think forever GMs deserve the dignity of hearing it plainly. Not because you're weak, not because you're bitter, but because you spent so long being told that carrying everyone else is the same thing as leading them. And it isn't, and it never was. So this is where I want to close it. If you are a forever GM and something in this hit a little too hard, if some part of you felt seen by it and another part of you wanted to reject it because it sounds too severe, too cynical, too unforgiving, then I think that reaction makes perfect sense. Because this is not an easy thing to admit to yourself when the hobby means something real to you. But I think it's worth admitting anyway, because the point is not to become colder. The point is not to become resentful. The point is not to punish your players for your competence. The point is to stop confusing overfunctioning with love. To stop mistaking asymmetry for generosity. To stop accepting silent dependence as though it were collaboration. To stop being so good at carrying the whole structure that nobody around you ever has to confront the fact that they are leaning. And maybe that's the real creativity paradox. Maybe the danger is not that your imagination is too big. Maybe the danger is that your imagination, your energy, your competence, and your care are so strong that they can keep a broken arrangement alive far longer than it deserves. And if that is true, then the answer is not to create even more or even harder. It is to step back just far enough that everyone else has to decide whether they are really there to build this with you, or whether they are only there because you made it effortless to consume. And that's not cruelty. That is clarity. That is the moment the hobby stops being a service you provide and starts having a chance finally to become a shared act again. This was Vindicast. See you next time. Bye-bye.